Hi, today we're going to be talking about foundations of psychology. And I'd like you to take a look at your syllabus when you can, because um, there are two videos that are listed on the syllabus that I'm going to ask that you watch on your own time. You can stop the lecture here and go watch the two videos, or you can watch them at the end of the lecture. It's fine either way, but they really do go hand in hand with what we're talking about. So please take a look at the videos. One is Ben Ambridge, The 10 Myths About Psychology Debunked, and the other one is Molly Crockett, and it's a TED Talk. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and make sure that you check out your syllabus for today, and also that you make sure to check out your journal assignments. So in this chapter, I'd like you to think about psychology. Think about, what is it? We're also going to be covering the history of psychology and what psychologists do. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we're talking about the start of psychology, psychology as a discipline didn't start until the late 1800s. It started specifically with Wilhelm Wundt, who opened a lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So what took so long? Before then, people actually did study psychology, but they just didn't call it that. Think about it. Writers wrote psychological profiles of people. How many of you have read Shakespeare? He goes into the characters in a deep way. Lady Macbeth, Hamlet, and so on. These are all psychological studies, as well as literature. I'm sure that you can think of examples today of film and writing that could be an example of a psychological profile. So here's how psychology developed and where it started. It started with philosophy. Psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, which means soul. And psychology was really thought of as a philosophy. It didn't become its own academic discipline until the late 1800s with Wilhelm Wundt. It is a social science because while so many areas of psychology study the biological roots of behavior, psychologists also study how our behaviors are influenced by others. We don't exist alone. So Plato said there were three parts to the soul. And as we already said, psyche means soul. So psychology could have been, and centuries ago was conceived as the study of the soul. Now it's the study of the mind and behavior. So Plato said there are three parts of the soul, but that we would now call part of the mind, and they are logic, spirit, and appetite. Logic is the rational part of us. This is the smallest part and is always wrestling with the other parts of the soul. The spirit is the part that controls our anger or temper. It can ally with logic to keep us just by being angry at unfair things, or it can keep us from getting out of control. And appetite. This is the part that wants. It doesn't care about right or wrong. It just desires. This is hunger, thirst, sex, etc. So Plato thought we were born with thoughts and innate knowledge. Today, we'd call this nature. We're born with our thinking and character, and the environment doesn't have anything to do with it. His student, Aristotle, laid the groundwork for empirical research. And that is gaining knowledge from observations and experiments. He believed that knowledge is based on experience, which is called nurture. So this is gaining our knowledge and character from our environment. So anyone of you who has kids, most people will think, oh, my kids are going to be born with all of their knowledge and personality and character. I'm going to be able to shape them with the environment that I'm giving them. These are the ways that we think of nature and nurture, how how much do you think of raising a child has to do with what they're biologically given, and how much is it the environment? There are a lot of twin studies that look at the differences between nature and nurture and the overlap between those as well. So most people think of psychology as the study and or treatment of people suffering from mental health issues. However, the field is huge. Psychology is a part of our everyday lives, but also many more fields than most people even know. And treating and studying mental illness is only one small aspect of psychology. And like I said before, psychology is a scientific study of the mind and behavior. So, a lot of people think that Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychology. So if you thought so, you're not, any different than a lot of people. A lot of people think that, but he isn't the founder of psychology. Wilhelm Wundt is. And you'll be able to read about this in the text. Wundt viewed psychology as a scientific study of conscious experience, and he believed that the goal of psychology was to identify components of consciousness and how those components combined to result in our conscious experience. Wundt used introspection. He called it internal perception. It's a process by which someone examines their own conscious experience as objectively as possible, making the human mind like any other aspect of nature that a scientist observed. And Wundt established his lab in the University of Leipzig, like I mentioned before, in Germany in 1879. If we move on to the American psychologist, William James studied functionalism. And functionalism refers to how mental activities help a person to adapt to their environment. So if you read the text, functionalism focused on how mental activities helped an organism fit into its environment. Functionalism has a second, more subtle meaning in that functionalists were more interested in the operation of the whole mind rather than of its individual parts, which were the focus of structuralism. The practical application of research was key with this movement. And now we move on to Sigmund Freud, who's known for his psychoanalytic theory, which focuses on the role of a person's unconscious, as well as early childhood experiences. And this particular perspective dominated clinical psychology for several decades. And your text gives an overview of the id, ego, and superego, as well as his psychosexual theory of development. We'll cover those in more detail in a later chapter, but please take a look at those in the text. Next is Gestalt psychology. So the key players here are Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kafka, and Wolfgang Kohler. And you'll be able to read about those in your text as well. Gestalt psychology deals with the fact that although a sensory experience can be broken down into individual parts, it's how those parts relate to each other as a whole. And this is often what the individual responds to in perception. Behavioral psychology is most well known by the work of Ivan Pavlov. And you've probably heard of classical conditioning, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the work of Ivan Pavlov. We'll talk more about his work in a later chapter. We'll touch now on Watson, who was known for his work on behaviorism. And as you'll read in the text, he was a major proponent of shifting the focus of psychology from the mind to behavior, and his approach of observing and controlling behavior came to be known as behaviorism. And a major object of study by behaviorists was learned behavior and its interaction with inborn qualities of the organism. And again, we'll go into more detail about these later on. B.F. Skinner, most of us have heard of B.F. Skinner. He's well known for the Skinner box. And he studied reinforcement and punishment as driving our behavior. Humanism is a perspective within psychology that emphasizes the potential for good that is innate to all humans. And then if we move on to cognitive psychology, as you'll learn from the text, cognitive psychology is radically different from previous psychological approaches in that it is characterized by both of the following. First, it accepts the use of the scientific method and generally rejects introspection as a valid method of investigation, unlike phenomenological methods such as Freudian psychoanalysis. And second, it explicitly acknowledges the existence of internal mental states like belief, desire, and motivation, unlike behaviorist psychology. So I've touched on quite a few of the individuals involved in the history of psychology. There are more than what I've touched on and more than what gets touched on in the text. I want to show you now and share my screen with you the history of psychology in a very short video. And so go ahead and take a look at this. This video is going to talk a little bit more about what we have. It's going to give a bit more depth with the history. So I think it'll be worth the while to take a quick look.
Hey, it's Dan Lear, human behavior expert, humanbehaviorexpert.com. And today I'm going to give you a short script, if you will, on the precursors of psychology. How did psychology come to be? When did it start? Who were the players? And here's the game summary. In the mid-1600s, about 1650, a guy named René Descartes. He was from France. He was an academician, a philosopher, a mathematician, and a scientist. And he was the first person, if you will, to distinguish between mind and body, almost like the ghost within the machine. René Descartes was the guy who quoted, "I think, therefore I am," creating a separation between mind and body. About 50 years later, in 1700, John Locke, an English philosopher and physician, came out with what he called tabula rasa. That's T-A-B-U-L-A, tabula rasa, which essentially meant blank slate. That human beings were born with no innate mind, that everything was learned. We had learned behavior. Shortly after that, in 1740-ish, if you will, David Hume came onto the scene. He was a British associationist who had a theory that our behavior was a result of associations based on memories and experiences we had. In 1830, 90 years later, the next guy to make some impact was a guy named Ernst Weber, spelt Weber. Ernst Weber, he was one of the first empiricists. And an empiricist was someone who believed that knowledge comes only from sensory experiences. Now, in 1870, things start getting interesting. Charles Darwin, who I'm sure you are familiar with from the theory of evolution, he was a naturalist, and he comes out with a theory of evolution. And prior to 1870, there was no psychology. There was no separate field. There was science and there was philosophy, and there was no psychology. But Charles Darwin opened the door with some of his studies. Now, in 1879 is when psychology was born. It was born by a gentleman named Wilhelm Wundt. That's a Wilhelm spelled with a W and Wundt spelled with a W, but he's from Germany. So it's Wilhelm Wundt, which is a much sexier name, if you will. He is the father of psychology. And the reason why he's given that name, if you will, is because he came up with the first lab. He created a lab at University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany, where people could do studies on human behavior, but also write about them in a journal. So as you can imagine, this was the first time where human behavior is being studied and being written about. And so people from all over were coming to Germany to take part in this new study, this new science called psychology. Now, right about the same time, here in America, William James was bringing psychology to the forefront. He was a prolific writer. He started off wanting to be an artist, but thank goodness for us that he became a writer. He wrote about psychology. He read about psychology. He really wasn't a psychologist, and he was an interesting guy. He grew up in a very wealthy family. His grandfather came over from Scotland, made a lot of money in real estate. They had an intellectual family. His brother, Henry, was an incredible writer. They used to sit around the table and talk about philosophy and Swedenborg and the like. Very educated guy. Now, like any pioneers, there's descendants that follow. And the person that followed Wilhelm Wundt, who made an impact in psychology, was Edward Titchener. He was a British psychologist who created structuralism. That he believed that everything in the human mind had structure. Now, the gentleman that followed William James was a guy who really, really catapulted behaviorism. We didn't know behaviorism yet, but Thorndike, he was an American psychologist who studied under William James, and he created what's called the law of effect. Now, this might sound familiar because the law of effect, which he publicized in 1903, said that organisms move toward pleasure and away from pain. Move towards pleasure and away from pain, the law of effect, which really set the stage for behaviorism. Now, in 1900, things start getting interesting and more familiar, if you will, because that's when Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist, came onto the scene, and he was an interesting guy, prodigious work, yet he was the first guy to talk about the unconscious mind. 1910, around that time, was Ivan Pavlov, and Pavlov's work and conditioned reflexes led to the rise of behaviorism. Shortly after that, around 1913, John B. Watson, who is the father of behaviorism, Watson says, hey, Thorndike and Pavlov are on the right track, but we can't study cats and dogs. We need to study human beings. And so Watson, he takes it to the next level. He goes to work at Johns Hopkins University. Why? Because they had a baby clinic there. So he was working with brand new infants, newborns, doing experiments, and more on Watson later. Shortly after Watson, the most prolific psychologist in the history of the world, in around 1950, B.F. Skinner was on the scene. And B.F. Skinner had a mission. This wasn't about conditioning rats. This wasn't about making pigeons turn in circles. This was a guy that was looking to create a better world. He was looking to condition human beings to have the most full, happy lives as possible. He was on the cover of Time magazine in 1971. And in 1960, a guy named Ulrich Neisser, that's U-L-R-I-C, Ulrich Neisser, he created what's called cognitive psychology, that said we could study things beside behavior, how people process information. And essentially, cognitive psychology was a study in how people perceive, remember, think, speak, and solve problems. So that's your short script, your game summary on the history of psychology. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find out more about psychology.
Okay, so we're able to see here in that video a much deeper, a lot more individuals who are involved in the history of psychology, and most of them we'll be talking about in later chapters. So if we move on, the 5 main psychological pillars or domains are biological, cognitive, development, social and personality, and mental and physical health. We will be covering all of these later. These are also covered in your textbooks, so take a look at them, but we will be covering all of those domains that I just mentioned in later chapters. So, what do psychologists do? Most of the time when a person thinks of a career in psychology, they think clinical psychology. But there are so many different areas of psychology that are really interesting and that most people don't even know about. So let's go through some of them. One thing I do want to point out is that if you're interested, you can find resources for careers in psychology by going to apa.org, then look up career resources, and they have guides for career resources there, a lot of resources. So if we're to think about APA, what they say is that psychologists are frequently innovators. Psychologists are known to often be evolving new approaches from established knowledge to meet the changing needs of people, organizations, and societies. So it's an ever-evolving field. And psychologists develop theories and test them through their research. As this research yields new information, the new findings become part of the body of knowledge that practitioners call on in their work with their clients and patients, as well as with their organization and communities. And we know that psychology is a tremendously varied field. Psychologists conduct both basic and applied research. They serve as consultants to communities and organizations. They diagnose and treat people. They teach future psychologists and those who will pursue other disciplines, they test intelligence and personality. Many psychologists work as healthcare providers. They assess behavioral and mental functioning and well-being, and they study how human beings relate to each other and also to machines, and they work to improve these relationships. So psychologists provide important knowledge and skills to help us better understand diverse cultures. And this is important because the United States has a varied population. It's important to understand diverse cultures, and psychologists do that. Psychologists also traditionally study both normal and abnormal functioning, and they treat individuals with mental and emotional problems. They also concentrate on behaviors that affect the mental and emotional health and mental functioning of healthy human beings. So an example would be that psychologists work with patients to help them change behaviors that are having negative effects on their physical health, things like smoking cessation. They also work with business executives, performers, athletes, and they work with these folks to reduce stress and to improve their performance. They advise lawyers on jury selection, and they collaborate with educators on school reform. Immediately following a disaster, psychologists help victims and bystanders recover from the trauma or shock of the event. Right now, we're seeing that with regard to the pandemic, and I'm sure that we'll be seeing more in the near future. They also team with law enforcement and public health officials to analyze the causes of such events and prevent their recurrence. So you can find some really useful videos of experts speaking about their field of psychology by going to careersinpsychology.org. I've just highlighted a few things that they do, but there is a really wonderfully long list of careers that are in psychology, and there's a description of each of those careers next to it. So if you go to careersinpsychology.org, you're going to be able to click on the career that you want to learn about, and the experts in that field will speak about their field of psychology. So we've come a long way in the field of psychology, and we do continue to grow. So this is an ever-evolving field, and we'll get more into detail about a lot of what we've talked about in this chapter, The Foundations of Psychology, in future chapters. But the point of this chapter is just to lay the groundwork for what we'll be discussing later. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture.